as you use, through a set of 6 shared values, each emanating from a central core of love. And I'll just read the very beginning of the language that introduces this. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are justice, equity, transcendence, pluralism, inclusion, and generosity. I'll say those again. You can look them up if you really want to know. Justice, equity, transcendence, pluralism, inclusion, and generosity. Who could argue with any of these, at least if you knew quite what they meant? We have to do a little study to get to that. The notion of love at the center is fundamental to this statement of values, and looking into how human love can be the essence and motivating force for a new theology is an ongoing part of my approach to our shared faith. Over the coming year, I hope to speak to each value separately, and today I will start with equity, what it is, how it manifests in our lives, and why it's important enough to be on our own list. First, I will read the words, the denomination attached to the word equity. Equity. We declare that every person is inherently worthy and has the right to flourish with dignity, love, and compassion. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. So there's some pretty profound words that we include under equity. We claim that people are inherently worthy and have the right not only to dignity, but also to flourishing with compassion and love. Now, to my ear, it's not obvious up front that all these are necessary products of equity, but it is nice to see that we didn't drop the most important idea from our old first principle, which is the inherent worth and dignity of all human beings. So I guess we need to learn a little bit more about equity to see how this works. And when I say equity, I'm referring to social equity. In daily parlance, you might know it more as a financial concept. Equity in finance, it's like the part of your house that you own and it's not in your mortgage. That's a really cool thing to have, but it's also totally irrelevant here. Most of us tend to consider equity and equality interchangeably and use them as synonyms. But as we might have learned in the Time for All Ages, this is not true. They are different. Equality is about making things even. It is quantitatively measurable in that everyone is given an equal piece of the pie or their own cupcake or whatever it is we're talking about, and everyone has identical rights and opportunities to engage in something. Equality is important. We fought for years to create a semblance of racial equality in America under the law in response to systematic discrimination and segregation. And for the civil rights era, equal voting rights were the critical outcome of that fight. Equity, by contrast, is making things fair. Sometimes that means things should be equal, but often it does not. Sometimes treating persons equally produces inequality. Over 100 years ago, Anatole France noted that the law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. To be fair and impartial, we must start by recognizing that everyone has different circumstances in life, and that they require different resources to reach what we would consider an equitable outcome. This may be as simple as knowing that a shorter person needs a taller ladder than a friend to reach the apples in the tree. More generally, it means identifying and removing structural barriers that prevent individuals or groups from thriving. Equity is about resource distribution and depends primarily on the systems of power and how they assume responsibility to provide for the well-being of all persons. Maybe the biggest difference between equality and equity is that equality is input-based. It says, how do we break things up before we hand them out? While equity is output-based. Everyone gets what they need to reach a specified end. Equity sounds far more like socialism. Equity raises tons of questions because its implementation always relies on assumptions regarding fairness and justice. None of this is objective because we only know what is fair and what is just by our opinions, by what we feel in our gut. Is that right? Is that fair? It just doesn't feel that way. I don't know. These are normative categories built from prevailing and often conflicting values. Equity relies on a concept of social justice that asserts that there are some things which all people should have. Basic needs we believe should be fulfilled, probably by the public pocketbook if necessary. It demands policies that consider the influence of existing inequality. And it demands policy that is exercised with care and compassion. Without going into detail, it demands that everyone should have access to food and shelter, quality medical care, remedial supports in education if needed, and full social service provision, even for marginalized communities and individuals. It is a belief that says the difference in human outcomes should not be determined by initial differences in wealth, income, or power. In recent American life, equity has been under highly visible assault as the centerpiece of the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, better known as DEI. And it's shown by the attacks on empathy and on woke culture. This is a major backlash against years of progress where we gradually learned that effective public policy requires adjustments for local context and structured inequality. It is no accident that the strongholds of the anti-DEI efforts are in historically racist states and areas, and that this position is pushed by groups with white supremacist agendas. The growth of Black, brown, and immigrant groups pose a direct threat to the white majority status quo. And the claim that African Americans and other groups suffered harmful consequence from years of overt discrimination that needs to be remediated, well, this is a threat to the white majority status quo. A new conservative political order has appeared, composed of many of the new American oligarch class and politically allied with racist and patriarchal Christian nationalist groups and others, all led by an autocratic and egomaniacal president. This coalition has fostered a climate committed to eradicating DEI efforts from government and public institutions and casting shame on wokeness and empathy in public affairs. In the name of preserving meritocracy and equality of opportunity, neither of which are bad ideas, they have returned to a culture that feels no restriction in populating many power positions with white, cisgender males, yet again. The most visible example of this of late is the recent purge of general officers in the United States military, and almost all of those removed have been female or persons of color. Our commitment to equity is necessary to encourage us to foster a society that works, to include all persons in a positive manner. It is based on the premise that all persons matter and that all persons have the same right to pursue their own interests as they understand them. Equity is a virtue that leads us to a higher expression of what we would like to be our true nature. It is how we can embrace interdependence and design systems that work as well for others as they do for us. Equity requires us to build awareness of the needs and desires of each segment of our population. Because it focuses on outcomes, it requires input from the voices of the affected persons in deciding what feels fair for them and what they wish to accomplish. Equity is not paternalism, it is empowerment. We wish to include persons on their own terms within their own worldview. And this entails listening carefully, making room for them to speak, and monitoring our own assumptions about what other people need. We're all familiar with the golden rule that appears in many religious traditions, and it usually goes something like, do unto others of you as you would have them do unto you. True equity requires an updated version, which I hear is now sometimes being called the platinum rule. This states, treat others the way they want to be treated. It improves upon the golden rule by shifting the focus from your preference to the specific needs, values, and perspectives of the other. We need to pay attention to how our world operates and how some persons are systematically prevented from thriving by our current policy and by structural barriers that limit their success. The legacy of enslavement and years of discrimination created deep harm within the African American community. Much of our native population exists in communities isolated from the flow of modern life. Immigrant groups are limited by many restrictions in life chances and often limited by language gaps and cultural separation. Women's rights continue to be threatened, and increasingly they're being removed. Persons with physical and mental challenges continue to have difficulty accessing the resources that others of us take for granted. And the list can go on and on and on. It's a big world, and a lot of things aren't fair. A value of equity states that all of these persons and others should be included, supported, and empowered as possible. They should be given access to the resources they need to flourish in their lives. And we, as you use, are saying that we agree and that we should use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to help build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. Accomplishing an equitable society is not our job per se, but removing barriers, fighting restrictions and biases, and advocating for inclusion is. All we want is a world that's fair Is that such a tall order? Not only that, we want the right to define what is fair and what is not, or at least the capacity to steer that judgment towards the persons affected by outcomes. Is this a little arrogant? Of course it is. But we have learned from experience that if we can't control the narrative, if we can't define the domain of human aspiration, then other persons with much different agendas, will do so in our stead. In the current climate, we have had some setbacks in our efforts to pursue equity and inclusion for our neighbors and friends. It is time to regain the moral argument and redirect those needs. I stand for the value of equity and will continue to declare that every person is inherently worthy and has a right to flourish, and that they can do so with dignity, love, and compassion. Amen. Ashe, blessed be.